Hey guys, today I'll show you a supernatural horror film named A Nightmare on Elm Street Part 1. Spoilers ahead, watch out, and take care. The movie begins with a girl named Tina finding herself in a funeral home, not knowing where she was. She could only run in confusion. A stranger's voice called out to her from time to time. She ran into the boiler room where a man suddenly appeared behind her, chasing her after her smell. She heard a few cat cries but saw nothing. Suddenly, the man appeared, embraced her, and scratched her sexy body with his steel claws. Tina woke up realizing it had been a nightmare. She looked down at her abdomen and saw 3 cuts on her pajamas, resembling wounds made by steel claws. She quickly grabbed a crucifix for protection, and the dream reminded her of a nursery rhyme from her childhood. Every child in town knew that the monsters in the rhyme would take their life in dreams. The next morning, Tina told her best friend Nancy about the nightmare. She couldn't sleep all night and felt scared. Nancy comforted her, not taking it too seriously. Later that night, Nancy and her boyfriend came to Tina's house to keep her company, as Tina's mother was leaving for a few days, and Tina didn't dare to sleep alone. As they were chatting on the sofa, Tina mentioned the man with the strange fingers in her dream. Nancy seemed surprised because she had also had a dream the night before. In her dream, there was a man wearing a sweater with fingernails like homemade blades. Tina was shocked by their dream of the same monster. At that moment, Nancy's boyfriend named Depp, the young Captain Jack Sparrow, interrupted their conversation. Before he could say anything, they heard a noise outside. The 2 girls followed closely behind him. Outside, Depp told them to stay back as he ventured into the darkness. He meowed a few times, but got no response. As he was about to speak, a figure suddenly tackled him, but it was Tina's boyfriend, Rod. The 4 of them playfully returned to their rooms one after another. At midnight, Tina was woken up by a knocking sound. She patted Rod, who was sleeping soundly, possibly being suffocated by her strong smell. She then went alone to check the window. Someone was throwing stones at the window and calling her name. At the same time, Nancy was also awakened by a noise. There was a faint shadow on the wall, which disappeared when she got up. She knocked on the wall with her crucifix, thinking she was having a hallucination. Afterward, Tina had already left her house. The silent street was empty and she followed the sound. Suddenly, a metal cover rolled towards her. Tina turned around and saw a man with a hat behind her. The man was short with extremely long arms and a few Wolverine-like blades on his hands. Even with the moonlight behind him, she could see the horrifying scars on his face. Tina turned and ran, but the man caught up with her. She screamed and ran back to the yard. She looked back and saw the man flexing 2 severed fingers with green blood oozing from them. Tina couldn't open the door and was quickly tackled to the ground. Rod was awakened by the screams beside him. Tina was struggling in her nightmare. He lifted the blanket and saw a few bloody marks appearing on her body. Then she flew into the air as if an invisible person was torturing her. Rod watched her fly to the ceiling, then fall and not move again. Nancy came to check, but was locked outside. Depp rushed over and broke the door down. Both were horrified by the gruesome scene. The police quickly arrived at the scene. After an examination, it was determined that Tina had been killed by a sharp weapon, but no weapon was found at the scene. Her boyfriend Rod, with a criminal record, was taken away as a suspect. Nancy's father, the sheriff, was in charge of the case. Nancy hadn't yet recovered from the shock, but she felt her friend's death was related to the nightmare. The next day, Nancy went to school as usual. On the way, she felt uneasy, as if someone was watching her from behind. Just as she looked back, Rod suddenly appeared, embraced her, and fell onto the grassland. He insisted he wouldn't hurt anyone. Nancy asked if he had killed Tina, since the door was locked from the inside and no one knew what had happened. Rod said he hadn't touched Tina, and there was someone else in the room. Seeing Nancy's suspicious gaze, he angrily warned her. Just then, Sheriff appeared with a gun, reminding Rod that he would be fine if he didn't move. Rod ran away but was quickly caught by the police outside. Nancy then realized her father had used her to lure Rod out. She was angry and ignored her father, turning to walk towards the school. Having stayed awake all night, Nancy couldn't help but doze off in class. In her drowsiness, the bloody Tina suddenly appeared at the door. She seemed trapped in a body bag, trying to say something to Nancy. Nancy glanced at her classmates, but no one reacted. When she looked back, there was only a pool of blood on the floor. She left the classroom and saw the body bag had been dragged away, leaving a trail of blood. She called out her friend's name, and an invisible hand dragged the bag around a corner. Nancy chased after the trail, running into a girl with pigtails. As she walked past the girl, a man's voice told her not to run in the hallway. Nancy turned around and the voice came from the pigtailed girl. She ignored the warning and continued chasing. She ended up in the basement, which resembled the funeral home in Tina's dream. A mysterious figure blocked her path, flexing a wound under his clothes. Nancy ran the other way with the man in hot pursuit. Finally, he cornered her, saying she should go to Freddy. Nancy screamed that it was just a nightmare. To wake herself up, she pressed her arm against the hot furnace pipe and woke up with a chicken scream. Her classmates all looked at her and the teacher came to comfort her. After calming down, Nancy left the school alone, finally breaking into tears. It was then that she noticed the burn on her arm, suspecting that the experiences in her dream might be real. She then went to the police station to see Rod and asked about the details of the murder case. Rod was sure that there was someone else in the room, but he couldn't see them. He could only see something on Tina's body, as if 4 blades were cutting her that time. He couldn't explain it all and could only treat it as a dream, just like the nightmare he had a few days ago. In that dream, the strange man had claw-like fingernails. Hearing this, Nancy was terrified. That night, strange events occurred again. Nancy was taking a bath, mumbling the nursery rhyme to herself. As she sang, she fell asleep. A knife-wielding hand slowly emerged from the water. Suddenly, her mother knocked on the door. She woke up and asked what was wrong. Her mother reminded her not to fall asleep in the bathtub, as there was a risk of drowning. Nancy impatiently responded, but fell asleep again after her mother left. Suddenly, it felt like someone was pulling her underwater. She was submerged in an instant. When she surfaced, she screamed for her mother, only to be pulled under again. Her mother heard her cries for help and rushed to knock on the door. Meanwhile, Nancy finally managed to escape and climbed out of the bathtub. Her mother rushed in, and she reassured her mother that she had merely sunk but still felt uneasy. Around midnight, Depp sneaked into Nancy's bedroom earlier because he lived right across the street. Nancy asked if people could dream about things that were about to happen. Depp didn't understand what she meant. Nancy then asked him to be her bodyguard as she wanted to find someone. Soon after, Nancy left the house alone and walked to the nearby police station. She called out Depp's name, and he showed his face to indicate he was still there. Nancy quickly found the cell and looked down through the window. The strange man was indeed looking for Rod. She called out to Depp again but got no response. She watched helplessly as the man easily passed through the iron door and hurriedly shouted for Rod to wake up. The man just looked at her and smiled, then suddenly vanished from her sight. At that moment, Tina's voice came from behind. Nancy turned around to see her friend standing there, waving at her, with centipedes crawling out of her mouth. The ground had also turned into a muddy swamp filled with centipedes. She called for Depp while moving along the wall. The strange man suddenly appeared from behind, startling her into running home. The man followed closely behind. After a long struggle, she finally ran upstairs to find Depp fast asleep. Nancy yelled at the mirror, insisting it was all a dream. The mysterious man suddenly burst out of the mirror and tackled her. The two wrestled their muscles in the room until the alarm clock suddenly went off, and Nancy and Depp finally woke up. She angrily scolded her boyfriend as she had only asked him to stay awake and watch over her, waking her up if she had a nightmare. Now, Nancy knew that the man was going after Rod. Not wanting to waste any time, she immediately rushed to the police station to confirm Rod's safety. However, the on-duty officer refused to let her in. Coincidentally, her father was there. Nancy pleaded with him to let her take a quick look. As they were getting the keys, the bedsheet on Rod's body twisted itself into a rope and moved toward his neck. Rod was quickly awakened by a powerful force. No matter how much he struggled, the rope yanked him off the bed and around the other side of the iron door. When Nancy others arrived, Rod was already hanging in midair, lifeless. Soon after, Nancy and her family attended Rod's funeral. After the funeral, she told her father that the killer was still at large. When Sheriff asked about the killer's identity, Nancy could only describe his appearance. Hearing that, Sheriff changed his expression as if he did know something. However, he said nothing and only asked his wife to keep an eye on their daughter. So the mother took Nancy to a sleep research center. The doctor connected a monitor to Nancy's head, preparing to examine her sleep condition. At first, the data was normal, but as she fell into a deep sleep, the readings soared. Nancy started to struggle in bed, and her mother quickly rushed in to wake her up. To everyone's surprise, there was an inexplicable wound on her body. Moreover, she was clutching a hat, which she claimed to have torn off the man's head. Not long after returning home, Nancy overheard her mother mentioning the hat on the phone. However, when she asked her father if he had investigated, her mother avoided the topic. Nancy knew that there was a psycho killer named Freddy, and she firmly believed that Freddy was after her. Unexpectedly, her mother not only knew about this man, but was also convinced that he was already dead. They had a big quarrel over this, and Nancy stormed out, determined to find a way to protect herself. She stayed out late, studying a book on setting traps. When night fell, she returned home and found that her mother had installed iron bars on all the windows. Nancy confronted her mother and finally got the answer she wanted. It turns out Freddy used to be a bastard who targeted children, killing at least 20 people in the area. The police finally caught him, but due to the prosecutor's negligence, he remained free. To protect their children, angry parents came to the place where he kept the children and burned him alive. That's why her mother firmly believed that Freddy couldn't harm anyone anymore. Nancy trembled as she listened. Since the adults refused to believe her that Freddy was still alive in their nightmares, she decided to deal with Freddy herself, pulling him out of her dreams like she did with the hat. Of course, this plan required Depp's help. They agreed to meet at midnight. As it approached 12 o'clock, Depp accidentally fell asleep in bed. Nancy was waiting for Depp to appear and called him. However, Depp's father didn't want them to date and hung up the phone directly. As Nancy was getting anxious, the phone rang again. Picking it up, she heard nothing but static and was so scared that she tore the phone line apart. However, the phone rang again shortly after. Gathering her courage, Nancy answered it. Freddy whispered, "I'm your boyfriend now." Then his mouth stretched out from the receiver and licked her smelly lips, using his long, snaky tongue. Nancy threw the phone away and stomped on it. Suddenly, she realized that Freddy had gone after Depp. However, her mother had locked the door and refused to open it under any circumstances. At that time, Depp was sound asleep in his bed, snoring like a pig. Suddenly, a ghostly hand with a knife emerged from beneath and pulled him into the bed, leaving only a hormone trace behind. Soon after, a gush of blood sprayed from under the bed. Depp's mother heard the noise and rushed over, only to see blood everywhere. The police quickly arrived at the scene, and the blood had seeped down to the floor below. The scene was horrifying. Nancy saw her father across the street in Depp's house and immediately called her father. Nancy told him she already knew who the killer was. However, when she mentioned Freddy's name, her father refused to believe her. Even so, she asked her father to promise that he would break into her room at 12:30, determined to catch Freddy herself. After hanging up, Sheriff ordered his men to keep an eye on his daughter's room and notify him immediately if anything happened. Meanwhile, Nancy was setting up traps in her home, placing them by her bed and at the door. After coaxing her mother to sleep, she set a 10-minute alarm on her watch and quickly fell asleep. In her dream, she made her way to the warehouse where Freddy was hiding, shouting his nasty name. As she walked into a corner with a fire, Freddy suddenly appeared. She fled, jumped, and landed back in her family's yard. Freddy disappeared again. With only a few seconds left until 12:30, Nancy grew anxious. Suddenly, he appeared to flex his muscles, but she grabbed his muscles tightly, refusing to let go. The alarm went off on time, and Nancy woke up from her dream with no sign of Freddy. Freddy suddenly rushed out from under the bed. Nancy ducked, avoiding the attack, and locked him in her room as she ran out. She then quickly ran to the window and called for her father's help. Sheriff's men shouted that everything was okay, but Nancy cursed and told them to call her father. After that, she ran downstairs to save her shitty life. The man broke through the door and accidentally fell down the stairs, landing right in front of her. The chase continued until Freddy was finally engulfed in flames in the basement. Nancy returned to the door calling for her father, who finally rushed out. The police broke down the door but didn't see Freddy. Nancy suddenly saw a trail of footprints and yelled that he had gone after her mother. They hurried to save her, but when Sheriff arrived, Nancy's mother had already been burned to a crisp. Her charred body vanished before the father and daughter. Nancy told her father to go downstairs first, and when she was alone in the room, Freddy slowly crawled out from the sheets. Nancy knew his weakness. This was just a nightmare. As long as she refused to believe, everything would cease to exist. With that, she turned her back to Freddy and twisted the doorknob. Upon opening the door, Nancy found herself back by her mother's side. Depp and his friends arrived in a car to pick her up for school. Just as she hopped into the car windows suddenly closed on their own. a ghostly hand emerged from behind her mother, hinting that the family was still haunted by the nightmare killer. This is Daniel CC Movie Channel. Stay safe and enjoy your day.